hypocrite, a complete hypocrite.
Well, is Australia still the egalitarian society it likes to think it is? We may still sit in the front seat of our cabs and call our Prime Minister's mate, but the gap between rich and poor is as big now as it has been for 80 years. Our guest tonight is the author of Battlers and Billionaires, the Story of Inequality in Australia. Dr Andrew Leigh is the Labor MP for the seat of Fraser. Before that, he was a Professor of Economics at the ANU. Andrew, welcome back to The Drum.
Thanks, Dave.
Now, you point out in the book that inequality fell markedly in Australia from the 1920s to the 1970s, but then it started increasing. Paint us a picture of how it changed.
Well, in the 1960s, according to one historian, Australia was a country where the rich felt a need to be accepted by the rest, rather than the other way around. Australia was at its most egalitarian, and then over the last generation we've seen wages fan out. If you're in the top 10%, your wages have gone up 59% after inflation. If you're in the bottom 10%, your wages have gone up just 15% after inflation. Top 1% share has doubled, and CEO salaries for the top 100 firms have gone up for an average of $1 million to $3 million. In fact, even if you just had consumption statistics, you'd know that inequality was rising because demand's going up for private planes, for helicopters, for Porsches, for Maseratis, for waterfront homes, and even for cocaine, something that Robin Williams once said was God's way of telling you you're making too much money.
Andrew, a lot of this inequality has increased since some of those major structural reforms happened in the economy in the 1980s, reforms that you support, things like floating the dollar, deregulating labour markets, getting rid of tariff walls, those kind of things. Is inequality a natural byproduct of those reforms, or can you have both? Can you have equality of income, and can you have those kind of reforms that grow the economy?
Steve, I think you're right to pinpoint those issues, because I don't think this is as simple as just turning the clock back to the 60s. Three big things increased inequality. The technology and globalisation gave huge returns to those at the top of the education distribution. The decline of unions from half the workforce to less than a fifth of the workforce meant that a big force that worked to improve egalitarianism in the workplace fell by the wayside. And the tax code got less progressive. So the top tax rate in the 70s was 70%, and that's fallen down to 45%. So those three big changes are not things you'd necessarily want to reverse, but they're worth understanding to see how we got here. And from here on in, I think the answer lies more in things like better evaluation of social programs, means testing, and also in making sure we invest in the education of the most disadvantaged.
Now, Andrew, reading your book, I can tell that you're a fan of both competition but also equality of opportunity. And I'd like you to apply both those principles to the New South Wales branch of the ALP, which we've been discussing today. Does competition and equality of opportunity exist in the New South Wales Labor Party when it comes to pre-selections?
Steve, certainly I think there are pre-selections which have been models of democracy in the New South Wales Party, and I'd certainly like to see more of them. I'm somebody who went through a rank-and-file pre-selection, and it's a great thing to do.
Well, if I can take up that point, I think in the ACT at the last election, there were two pre-selections, both rank-and-file pre-selections, and they turned out two candidates, yourself and Gai Brodmann, who were outside the normal realm of ALP candidates. In the New South Wales branch, there was 6 rank-and-file ballots out of 48. So does that suggest that New South Wales needs a little bit more competition, a little bit more equality of opportunity?
I think rank-and-file ballots are, by and large, the best way of selecting candidates, or another democratic process. I'm open to the notion of primaries if, in circumstances where the number of branch members has fallen below the level that you get a good democratic say. But one way or the other, I think that large groups of people in general make better decisions than smaller groups of people. So I think we ought to embrace democracy, and I think the Prime Minister has clearly done that in his statements today.
So are you advocating a larger parliament then? Do we need more politicians?
Well, that would go down well with the Australian community. Yeah.
You're quite right there, Kerry. The ACT Assembly is surprisingly small. There might be a case for it there. Probably not so much in the federal parliament.
Scott, you got a question for Andrew?
Yeah, Andrew, Scott Stevens. Back to something much more exciting, namely the economics. I know that one of the real indices of inequality in other countries, thinking specifically of the US and especially the UK, is not just disparity of wages or of wage growth, but also disparity of asset ownership. How, in your research, how does Australia fare in comparison to, for instance, the UK?
Well, Australia's in the top third of the developed country OECD for our level of inequality, and that's pretty much true whether you look at earnings inequality, income inequality or wealth inequality. We're not as unequal as the United States, but I think we're tracking away from where many Australians would like us to be. The analogy I use in Battlers and Billionaires is two sporting codes, English Premier League and AFL. In English Premier League, a single team, Manchester United, has won 12 of the last 20 seasons. It's the most tiresomely predictable sporting code on the planet. AFL, no team's won more than 3 of the last 20 seasons. And there's a structural reason for that, because in AFL they share the TV revenue, they have a salary cap, and they have a player draft, which ends up making the game more interesting. And so for me, the question is, do we want to end up with a society that's more like the EPL or the AFL?
Andrew, if I could ask you about education, because you write about that in the book as well. Obviously, we've got the Gonski reforms, or what we used to refer to as the Gonski reforms, as being something that's been pushed through. Now, that is aimed at improving equity in schools. Could that help reverse the inequality that you've mapped in your book?
I think it certainly could, Steve, and the key is to make sure that that money is spent in the way that that decreases educational disadvantage. There's actually one of the scariest graphs I find in the book is that places with more inequality in test scores have more inequality in the labour market. And we've now got a situation where a disadvantaged kid at year 12 is tracking about where an advantaged kid was in year 9, where the gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians in school performance sit at about a year in primary school and 2 years in secondary school. And unless you manage to close those gaps, I don't think we're going to be able to live true to that credo of equality of opportunity. It's not about putting lead in the shoes of the fastest runners, but it's about making sure that the kid at the back of the pack who's running barefoot at least gets a pair of running shoes.
Andrew, thanks very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Steve.
Andrew Lee, and his book is called Battlers and Billionaires, and it looks at the issue of inequality in Australia.